This is Talking Foreign Policy, a critical look at Canada's role abroad, and I'm Yves Engler. On Monday, Paul Kagame won elections with over 99% of the vote in Rwanda, extending his 30 years of rule. As Kagame has unleashed mayhem in Eastern Congo over the past decades, but again, over the past 2 years, he has received important Canadian support. Just recently, Canada's High Commissioner in Kigali, Julie Crowley, celebrated the elections. On election day, she noted, "Voting day in Rwanda. Congratulations to all who voted." But her or other Canadian officials haven't said anything about the farcical nature of those elections. In recent months, Crowley, Prime Minister Trudeau have described Canada's good bilateral relations, well-established relationship, and support to Rwanda. So the Canadian government has been supportive of the Kagame government in recent years and going back a long time. At the opening of Canada's High Commission in Kigali, I believe it was last month, Crawley met with James Kabarebe, and she noted, "Thank you, Minister of State James Kabarebe, for launching our renewed and strengthened relations." A 2012 UN report cited him as an organizer and armor of the M23 rebels who've been fighting at that point in Eastern Congo and have been fighting again in recent months in Eastern Congo. To discuss this, we have Judy Rever, author of the very good book In Praise of Blood, The Crimes of Rwandan Patriotic Front, and a recent article in Canadian Dimension headlined Canada's Whitewashing of Africa's Most Ruthless Regime. Thanks a lot for coming on to Talking Foreign Policy, Judy. And can you just tell us a little bit about about the recent elections, about opponents or opposition candidates who weren't allowed to run and the like?
Yes, the backdrop is that three contenders, possible contenders or opposition candidates in Rwanda, in particular, Victoire Ingabire, who is a Hutu opposition leader in Rwanda, who has been previously jailed. She was barred from running. There was another woman named Diane Rwigara, barred from running, and a third candidate who has some support, who was also barred from running. So basically, Kagame ran against himself in a farcical vote and won or recorded more than 99% of the vote, as you mentioned earlier in your introduction. And this should be embarrassing for any world leader, but it's not. It should be condemned by the international community, but there doesn't seem to be any condemnation coming. So what is interesting, and you mentioned the strengthening of Canada's bilateral relationship with Rwanda. It's been strengthened in the last 2 years. Canada opened a high commission in Kigali in 2022 at the height of the resurgence of one of Kagame's most brutal militias, the M23. Now, this is a rebellion that's been in existence for more than a decade, but the rebellion reignited in 2022. And at that time, Canada decided, well, in all of its wisdom, that it was going to strengthen relations and open up this high commission because it stated that it needed to fight Chinese and Russian influence on the continent. So this is really quite appalling because, as I said, in 2022, Kagame's troops reinvaded, and this is just another iteration of the wars that Kagame has waged since 1996. So for 28 years, Kagame has created, armed, financed, and steered rebellions in Eastern Congo. And this should be condemned, but it's not. And the latest is a serious crime of aggression. The United Nations declared last month that this was a violation to Congo's sovereignty and territorial integrity. It's a crime of aggression, which is one of the most serious international crimes. And Canada is not condemning it, condemning the crime or condemning this regime, but is cozying up to it. So it should be sanctioning Rwanda, but it's not. And so there are all kinds of geopolitical reasons for that, of course, which we can get into.
Yeah, well, on one hand, saying that we're countering Russia's role in Africa because Russia has done the act of aggression in Ukraine, which I think is correct. It's obviously more context as well, but then deepening relations with Rwanda as it's committing the act of aggression in Congo seems a little bit contradictory. The UN, I know, pointed out I think they said there was 3,000 or 4,000 Rwandan troops in Eastern Congo, and not just that they're actually, supporting the M23, which I think was kind of widely known for a long time, but that there was actually large numbers of Rwandan troops on the ground. I found this UN report, I guess, came out about a month ago or something like that. I saw a Canadian Global Affairs statement. They don't talk about it much, but it had a statement that said, Canada is deeply concerned by the final report of the UN group of experts on the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Canada calls for Rwanda to end its support to the M23 and for the DRC to end support to the FDLR, which I found kind of interesting because it very much sort of two-sided the issue, when I think it's pretty widely known that the main issue at hand here is the act of aggression from Rwanda principally, but also Uganda has a bit of a role here. But can you kind of, I guess, maybe give us a bit more on that, like, and also just how we don't see much about it in our media, but like we're talking about 2 million people that have been displaced in the last 2 years or so, and we don't know exactly how many people have been killed, but I think it's safe to say certainly thousands of people who've been killed. It's pretty major impact in Eastern Congo. Can you give us a bit more about that, and then maybe some of the history as well?
Well, as you say, it's a very dire situation in the eastern Kivu provinces. Up to 2 million people, perhaps more, have been displaced in the last 2 years alone. But the wars that have been waged principally by Rwanda since 1996 have displaced many more millions and also killed anywhere between 6 and 10 million. I mean, the empirical studies have not been done, but there's several million people who have been killed as a direct result of war, but also war-related diseases. So this is very serious. As you mentioned, there are up to 4,000 troops, Rwandan troops, directly on the ground. And this is simply the latest phase of a series of proxies and rebellions that Kagame has waged since 1996.
And can give some of the background, like your book, in Praise of Blood, the crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front. Like, you give a whole background to sort of what happens after the genocidal violence of 1994, and then Rwanda intervening in Congo to overthrow the government in 96, and then reinvading in 98, and multi-country war and all that kind of stuff. Can you give a little bit of that sort of background to bring us up to understanding Rwanda re-entering Eastern Congo in recent years?
Well, in 1996, 2 years after the genocide, the Rwandan military under Kagame, but led by a man named James Kabarebe, who you mentioned earlier, invaded Congo ostensibly Rwanda said, to bust up the Hutu refugee camps in eastern Congo, in what was then called Eastern Zaire, because more than a million, but a few million Hutus fled in fear during the genocidal violence in 1994. So many of them settled in other countries, and a vast majority of them, a significant portion of them, settled in Eastern Congo, and they were set up in refugee camps. And Kagame said these people pose a threat because some of these camps were armed by members of the previous regime, and so he decided to go in. And at the same time, he decided, because he had the military power to do so, to then continue across Zaire, which was presided by Mobutu Sese Seko, and unseat Mobutu. So that's basically what Kagame did. And during that military campaign, Eve, Kagame's ethnic Tutsi troops were accused of committing genocide against Hutu refugees. And if you remember, during the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, Tutsis were victims of a genocide. Now, my book that I wrote is a re-examination of that violence, essentially in 1994, and it basically sheds light on, it examines, it scrutinizes what Kagame's troops did in 1994 during the genocide. So it waged a genocidal campaign as well against Hutus. So Hutus were the former elements of the Hutu regime in 1994, and Hutu militia committed a genocide against Tutsis in 1994. And my book looks at what Kagame's Tutsi-led troops did to the Hutu population, which was comparable in terms of atrocities and numbers dead. So I look at that, and then because I was in Congo during or immediately after the overthrow of Mobutu Sese Seko, I interviewed many people in the jungle in Congo and in the cities that were already under control of Kagame's troops. Kagame and his military had established control and set up shop in Congo in 1997. And so I look at the wave of violence in Congo during that military campaign, and then how Kagame had, in those months and in those years after the campaigns of violence his regime waged against the Congolese people. So what's happening now is, as I said, an iteration of the number of proxies and rebellions and the steering of military operations since 1996 and 97. There have just been a series of militias that he has formed, created, and used in order to essentially, I mean, in the early days, it was pillaging Congolese resources and also getting access to land in Eastern Congo. And that's essentially still the dynamic. We know that in unseating Mobutu, Kagame, the regime opened up an economic corridor for the world, because a lot of the global economy starts in Congo. We look at Congo, it's the biggest producer of cobalt, for example, very big producer of copper. It's also producing what they call artisanal minerals, 3TG, that's tantalum, tin, and tungsten, and gold. And tantalum in particular, you may have heard, it's a derivative of coltan, and tantalum is what drives electronics. It's essential for the manufacturing of cell phones and computers. It's also essential in defense applications and smart economies, smart cars, aviation, aeronautics, all of that stuff. So that is produced in Eastern Congo. And Congo is the world's biggest producer of that strategic critical mineral. And for years, Kagame has been pillaging, has been laundering that mineral. And I would say that Rwanda has become strategic for the global supply chain of these minerals, because Kigali now, or Rwanda, is used as a transit hub for this mineral. So Kagame's troops go in, or it's Kagame's proxies, launder those minerals from Eastern Congo and then export them from essentially Kigali. Now, Rwanda has a very weak mining market. It does have some mines. It does mine a few of these metals, but not enough, not in substantive quantities to be able to export the amounts that it's exporting. And we're just seeing in US official statistics that came out recently that coltan, or tantalum, is up 50% in the last year. Rwanda is so-called producing. Of course, it's not producing 50% more. It's exporting 50% more in the last year. And that's because it's had greater access to the mines in Eastern Congo, which are very lucrative and very rich in this mineral.
So this 3-decade-long process of kind of stealing Congolese resources is a big part of the backdrop to the war fighting. And as we mentioned, we have, Kagame is a pretty open dictator, getting 99% of the vote. So the kind of combination of dictator, he's also, obviously, people know probably he's assassinated all kinds of his former allies in South Africa and Kenya, and there's efforts, even I think yourself has been put on lists of targets by the Rwandan intelligence agencies and the like. So it's quite a brutal government, both domestically and in the region. In your recent piece in Canadian Dimension, which again is titled Canada's Whitewashing of Africa's Most Ruthless Regime, you point out that some pretty prominent Canadians are close to Kagame. That's something, obviously, Romeo Dallaire has been close to Kagame for many, many decades. That's well known. Also, the president of the Toronto Raptors, Masai Ujiri, who has this project Giants of Africa, where Kigali is kind of the base, it seems like, for the project on the continent. They actually have some economic relationships with Kigali, with the Rwandan government. Can you kind of give us a little bit about that? That's an issue that hasn't received much attention.
Well, yes, as you say, Masai Ujiri, head of the Toronto Raptors, has created an African basketball league as an offshoot of the NBA, and Rwanda is a centerpiece of that African basketball league. But more recently, and this is what I've written about, Masai Ujiri, he's a very wealthy individual, Canadian, a high-profile guy, kind of what I would describe as a celebrity here in Canada. He was granted about 6 acres of land in Rwanda, in the capital, by presidential order by Paul Kagame. So this is really extraordinary, because Rwanda is a tiny country that suffers from land scarcity. The lack of land, access to land for food, was one of the contextual precursors of the genocide in 1994. Land issues are really serious in this country, and here one of the wealthiest Canadians gets granted a fair chunk of land. And I've discovered that The land is going to be used for, it's already being developed for a very swanky real estate project in the middle of the Rwandan capital that's going to develop a boutique hotel with a rooftop terrace and bar and gym and podcast studios, wellness spaces, things that one would associate with very high net worth individuals. This in a country that where up to 60% of Rwandans don't have access to clean water within 15 minutes of where they live. Only 60% actually have access to clean water within 15 minutes of their dwelling. 1 in 3 children is stunted because of malnutrition. Those statistics of severe malnutrition go up to 50% in some communities. There's tremendous poverty in this country. And so this urban development project, which is a big investment by a company called Helios Fairfax. Now, Helios Fairfax is a company whose independent directors include Masai Ujiri and Romeo Dallaire. And Romeo Dallaire is the former commander of the peacekeeping forces, UN peacekeeping forces of Rwanda during the genocide. He has a rich history in Rwanda. He too is close to Kagame, like Masai Ujiri. And so they have business interests now in Rwanda. And this is extraordinary because of the criminal nature of the Kagame regime, which we've been talking about. So I think it's worth looking at why these individuals are whitewashing the regime, why they're throwing money and granting material support to an individual and to a regime that has inflicted so much harm on 13.5 million people, but also the country next door where so many millions of people have died. But, you know, Kagame, or rather Romeo Dallaire, has supported Kagame for many, many years. And I point out that the Dallaire Institute, which is run out of Romeo Dallaire's Institute, which is run out of Dalhousie University, is funneling Canadian government money in the amounts of several $1 million to an African training center in Rwanda. And this, with the idea behind this African training center, which is financed by the Dallaire Institute, is to combat the recruitment of child soldiers. But this is the ultimate farce because Kagame, over the last 3 decades, has forcefully recruited child soldiers. He's recruited, kidnapped and recruited child soldiers during the early days of his rebellion before he seized power in 1994. And the Rwandan Defense Forces, earlier the Rwandan Patriotic Army, as it was called, they've been doing this in Congo for decades. And it's been documented by the United Nations year after year. Yet Kagame yet Dallaire is sending the money. So this is really quite extraordinary. And I think the mainstream media or activists, human rights activists, should really question Romeo Dallaire over these decisions, which are immoral.
Agreed. I think that your work on this issue has been very important, and I think definitely the connections at the corporate level need to be further explored by researchers and activists and those interested in liberating Eastern Congo or Congolese from this constant violence from Rwanda. I think we're going to leave it at that. Thanks a lot for coming on Talking Foreign Policy. Again, Judy Rever is the author of The Crime, In Praise of Blood, The Crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, and I invite people to check out the book. Thanks a lot for coming on Talking Foreign Policy.
You're welcome.